Okay, now let's move on to functions. So what are functions in Python? Functions in Python are simply blocks of reusable code, right? So if we want to do, or if we find ourselves doing something repeatedly and we do not want to have to rewrite the same logic all over again, we can use a function to containerize that particular code logic that we're going to do over and over again. So let's say we have a messaging application, we have a chatting application, and then we want to send messages, right? In the messaging application, people send messages. So how would that look like? Let's say we want to take a message. We can say we'll take a message. Message is equal to hello, and then we'll take a sender, and then let's say this is somebody, me, and then we'll take a receiver. Let's say this is another person, and then ideally whenever we do this, we want to send the message to the receiver. So after we have sent it out, we want to print something like the sender sends the receiver the message. So we want to print something like Toby sent Susan hello. We want to print this. Now obviously these are hard-coded values. If let's say we had another sender and we had another message and we had another receiver, we would have to rewrite this print statement all over again and this entire logic over and over again. But this becomes tiring, right? So how do we containerize this? How do we make a function? How do we put this as a function? So the simple syntax for a function is the def keyword. That means define or whatever. I don't really know what it means or if it has a meaning, but that's the keyword. Then function name. So you're giving it a function name. Then brackets, into brackets you have your parameters. Don't worry, we'll go over that. And then colon, and then indented under that you have your block of code to be performed once that function is called. Again, we would also go over that, what it means to call a function. But for now, let's look at defining our function. So let's try and implement this in a function in a way that we wouldn't have to hard code the values every single time and it would be adaptive. So first we define our function, def. What do we want to call our function? Let's call it send message, right? Send message. Okay, so now that we have chosen a function name, all we have to do is provide it with parameters, right? So what are parameters? Parameters are simply, you can think of them like variables, but these variables are what only your function has access to. So ideally, you would want your parameters to be used by your function. These are things you would want to make use of within your function. You'd want to collect from the user and make use of in your function. So think of it like input statements, but for your function. Input statements that are variables, but for your function. So with the function we're trying to implement needs a message, it needs a sender, and needs a receiver. Ideally, this will be collected from the user or the specific use case. So we can make that parameters within our function. We can say message is a parameter, then we have a sender and we have a receiver. It's as simple as that. So colon, and then what do we want to do? What we want to do is we want to print this sort of interactive message. So how do we implement that? Well, we'll simply implement that by print, then we would use formatted strings, then we would say Toby. What we're trying to implement says Toby, and Toby is our sender, so we'd say sender, because sender is whatever they will supply as that variable, and then it would automatically, the value of that will automatically be printed. So sender sent receiver message. It's as simple as that. We have implemented our first function. That's basically all there is to functions. You just define it, give it the parameters and a name, and then the block of code you want to execute repeatedly. So how do we actually make use of this function? We make use of this function by calling it. So how do we call the function? We simply call a function by writing the function name, which is send message, and then into parentheses we provide what we want to supply the function, what we want to want the function to make use of. So ideally, before we use a function, we actually know the parameters. We know what the function is expecting, so we can provide it in the same order as it is. Of course, we can change this order, we can do some other things, but this is beyond our scope for now. So when we are passing these parameters, because we actually have to pass these parameters that we defined when we are calling the function. When we are passing it, they are no longer parameters, they are now called arguments, things we supply the function to make use of. So what are the arguments he expects? He expects a message. So let's use hello. Then it expects a sender. Let's use Toby. And then he expects a receiver. Let's use Susan. So let's delete this since we don't need to use it anymore. We already implemented it. And then here we have successfully called, and we have provided it with arguments. So here we have successfully implemented and made use of our function. So once we run this function, once we call this function and run this code, this block of code will be executed. This is what will be executed. So ideally, you should see this interactive message within the terminal. So let's run it. Beautiful. Toby sends Susan hello. We get it, all because we have defined it. Now keep in mind, you can change up these values however you want. The whole idea is to be able to use it multiple times in different ways once you have given it the basic structure. So let's say you wanted Timothy to send, sorry, that's an error, Timothy to send Jason what's up. Let's say we just wanted to hear what's up with him. So notice if we run this, we have a different message. Why am I okay, sorry. Toby sent what's up Timothy. Sorry. Timothy sent, okay, sorry, it's not supposed to be like this. I mixed up the order. So it's supposed to be message, then sender and receiver. Yeah. So Timothy sent Joshua what's up. And just by implementing these two lines of code, we can perform this over and over again. That's the power and beauty of functions in Python. Now, there's also something you can do with functions. You can give it a return statement. So let's say instead of printing this, you wanted to be able to assign this to a variable and let's say make use of it later. All you would have to do is use a return statement. So you just say return whatever this is. Return simply means the output of this function will no longer be a print statement or anything. It would be as if this function is a variable holding whatever you put within this return statement. So here we are putting this formatted string. So that simply means it's returning it whenever it's called. So that means you can assign this to a variable. You can then say chat message is equal to this, and then once you run it, notice we don't get the print statement anymore, but it actually works, and this output being made using this set of values, this arguments we gave it, has been assigned to this variable, and then we can manipulate this variable. So if we wanted to see it, we could just say print chat message, and we would be able to see it. Timothy sent Joshua what's up. You can then do loads of other, I don't know, string methods on this however you please, but just know that if you want to be able to assign your function as a variable, or rather as a value to a variable, it has to return something. You have to give it a return statement. So you could even return any type of data type. You could return a number, let's say 6, just depending on your choosing. Just know that whatever you return is the value that your function would hold. It's as simple as that. So that's just been a basic overview of functions in Python.